From a game design perspective, there is nothing interesting about flipping a coin. There's no skill expression, no strategy, no unknowns to explore. And yet, I don't know about you, I'm willing to gamble that there is something about that dead simple 50-50 probability that makes it impossible to look away. And to push my luck a bit more, I reckon there's decent odds that, ironically, one of the only things about human nature that's entirely consistent is that none of us can resist a game of chance. From all the way back in the ancient days of Knucklebones and the royal game of to the classical titans of Blackjack and Mahjong, to modern cornerstones like Magic the Gathering, Dungeons & Dragons, and of course Luigi Poker on Super Mario 64 DS, randomness is at the heart of some of the most influential and popular games ever made, and there is nothing better at grabbing and keeping hold of the human attention span than good old-fashioned RNG. We find ourselves obsessed with any game that has randomly generated chests or packs to open. Random levels turn gameplay that would otherwise get stale after just a few runs into infinitely compelling variations. Stuff like critical hits feel way more exciting and powerful than the mathematically equivalent increase in damage. We love using dice rolls to determine success and failure in RPGs, even when that means giving up control over a game's story. And even though gambling games have almost nothing in the way of skill expression, meaningful choice, or even fairness in their design, there is just something about chance as a fundamental gameplay concept that grabs onto the human brain and will not let go. Now, that's all pretty obvious stuff, isn't it? Our brains like randomness. So what? Well, what if I told you that in spite of my earlier pontificating, there's pretty good odds that our relationship with chance is a bit more complicated than it first appears, particularly when considered in the context of all the randomness-centric genres that have been taking over video games lately. Everything from synergy-building, number-go-up games, to screen-clearing bullet heaven titles, which were literally pioneered by someone who used to design slot machines, by the way, not to mention the ever-popular roguelikes and loot-hunting action RPGs, are, for better or for worse, predicated almost entirely around chance. In fact, you can make a decent case that the theme of the last decade of game development, between loot boxes and procedural generation and adapting gambling mechanics into games, has been randomness, and it's this shared fixation that explains the compulsivity and replayability that all of these varied genres possess. But therein lies the catch. See, while for the last 2 minutes I've been really overemphasizing just how universally enticing and compelling randomness is, there's one big thing about RNG that I have pointedly neglected to mention. Namely, the fact that whilst, yes, our brains are naturally drawn to games of chance, that doesn't mean that chance is actually fun. Think about it, right? If you've ever gotten excited at the prospect of getting some new gear drops, but instantly bored at the prospect of actually using it, or midway through a Vampire Survivors knockoff, and realised that you're just mindlessly clicking the thing with the highest rarity every time, or to a new exciting frontier in a procedurally generated world, only to realise that it feels basically the same as everywhere else, then you've experienced the fact that chance is a powerful, but sometimes very fleeting high, not unlike meth, with which I'm sure we're all familiar. This is the double-edged sword to games of chance. Or maybe the other side of the coin is a better metaphor. While randomness is a key component of some really fun games, and because of our hunter-gatherer mental programming it is almost always absorbing and engaging to watch, it is, in of itself, not very much fun at all. And the real danger of this combination is that while our brains are distracted by the constant dopamine drip feed of surprise and anticipation, it becomes very difficult to realise just how long it's been since we've exercised our skill, made an interesting decision, or done anything that makes games actually enjoyable and satisfying, rather than just attention grabbing. What this means is that many random games are completely absorbing in the moment, but ultimately leave us annoyed, drained, and dissatisfied. And from an outside perspective, it's very difficult to tell which titles are going to do this to us. It's quite natural to assume, based on this information, that the cause of games that trick us into not having fun is that some of them are just too random, and it's equally hard not to draw a link between the optimization of some of video gaming's most obviously exploitative RNG and the rise of all those newfangled chance-heavy genres that I mentioned earlier, and conclude that randomness itself is what leads to games being distracting but unfulfilling. However, I think there's a bit more going on here. After all, as I illustrated at the start of the video, many of the most famous, long-lived, and importantly best games ever wouldn't exist without randomness, with some of them having extremely high levels of variance. But that doesn't make them any less fun to play, or any less rewarding to look back on. And the same is true for more modern games. Many of the best RNG-centric titles out there right now are incredibly random, but for reasons that aren't immediately clear, that hasn't led them into the trap of creating experiences that are only superficially engaging rather than actually being fun. That naturally begs the question, if it's not the amount of RNG used, what actually distinguishes good, artfully used randomness from randomness that tricks us into not having fun? Well, if you ask me, I think that the dangers of chance as a game design theme only begin to manifest when RNG mechanics begin to supersede our agency of players and our ability to express our skill. Because rather than serving as a way to stimulate and support our play, randomness that feels like it has more influence over us as players than we have over it ends up making us feel like our decisions and our effort don't matter. And it's when games start to feel pointless rather than simply chaotic that we lose our grasp on what makes them satisfying, leaving us only with that hollow feeling of gambling that occupies our stupid base level K-person brain but also distracts us from the fact that our higher functions aren't being nourished. Eagle-eyed viewers may note that this is the exact same foundational psychology that fuels a gambling addiction. This is not a coincidence, and we'll get back to it later. In short, I think that good, well-implemented randomization sets itself apart from shallow, bad randomization in two key ways. First, it creates additional scope and depth for decision making rather than making a game feel more simplistic or shallow. And second, it provides consistently novel and important feeling results that can capture not just our attention, but also our interest and imagination. And so, in that vein, what I want to do is to showcase how good games use chance responsibly, both to create types of experience that couldn't exist outside of a random framework, whilst also avoiding the pitfalls of all too many games that end up getting eaten from the inside out by those very same systems. And where better to start than the idea that while chance often appears to be a very simplistic and uninteractive gameplay dynamic, after all, the whole point of randomness is that it's more or less out of our hands, this needn't always be the case. As my good personal friend Shadow the Hedgehog is always telling me, chaos can be controlled. And by opening up the front and back end of random systems to be tinkered with by players, developers can create a huge amount of gameplay out of basically nothing at all, and can transform otherwise incredibly simplistic dynamics into something way more complex. The best way of demonstrating this is to show you a game called Queue Up, which is a parody of esports games that operates entirely around the flip of a coin. 3 hits and you win, 3 misses and your team loses. And far from feeling pointless and arbitrary, Queue Up's matches feel amazing because the game uses this dynamic as a foundation for surprisingly strategic gameplay. See, each hero has their own unique ability, like this guy who cares about getting streaks of wins or losses, or this streamer guy who builds up fans, as well as a bunch of gear to buy which all provide passive effects, and a big skill grid that gets bigger and more complex the more you level up. And while all of these effects either derive their results from the coin flip itself, or are entirely random in a different way, the fact that you can combine each of these individually random effects allows the player to build emergent synergies that reflect a way deeper optimization problem to solve than the sum of Queue Up's parts would imply. This is what I mean when I say that RNG used well actually increases the amount of gameplay a title has to offer. The possibility space of random mechanics and the ability to control their inputs and outputs creates opportunities for planning and synergies that otherwise wouldn't exist, and this allows games to capitalize on the fun of being high variance whilst also generating new chances for strategy in the process. This is the secret ingredient of Balatro, and also its inspiration, Luck Be a Landlord. In Balatro, for example, if you're only playing the hands you're dealt from an unmodified deck, then you're probably going to lose, because optimal play is all about leveraging all the ways the game gives you to nudge the odds in your favour, knowing which cast to mulligan to get another go at drawing a better combo, how best to use the random pool of jokers to amplify your scores, and most dramatically of all, how you want to manipulate your deck to literally change the pool you draw from, doing stuff like getting rid of all the reds like a true McCarthyist, or filling your deck with nothing but kings like a modern day American politician. Similarly, Luck Be a Landlord might be a roulette game on a conceptual level, but the fact that you decide what goes on the wheels, even if you can't decide where they end up, allows you to control the possibility space of the game, making sure that even if you can't guarantee any one adjacency will happen, you can still build a board state that you have a large degree of macro level control over, creating satisfying tactics within that random framework. Unfortunately, this isn't true for many of the successor games to Balatro's indie darling legacy, which often forget to give the player enough axes to manipulate their random systems in order for our skill to feel more important than the RNG. Clover Pit is also a slot machine game, but rather than giving you any direct control over the wheels, you can really only hedge your bets on a particular symbol or shape, and after that it's up to RNGesus, making your wins feel kind of unearned and your losses feel all the more frustrating. You can also see this dynamic in other places too. Dungeons & Degenerate Gamblers is a blackjack take on Balatro with some very fun card designs, but without giving you much of an ability to take mulligans or influence your draws, you're still mostly just sort of playing blackjack, which means you still constantly get into what feel like unwinnable game states that you have no control over, something that's excusable in a casino game, but less tolerable in a roguelike. But it's the surprisingly popular niche of pachinko and or physics-based number go up games that really demonstrate how important being able to manipulate, not just watch, randomness is. All of these games are great fun to see pop off, but because you never really have any way to predict, control, or react to the physics fireworks display on your screen, your victories just feel like you temporarily earned the favour of Jean-Baptiste Perrin, and your defeats feel like there was nothing you could do to prevent them. Nubby's Number Factory is one of the better games in this regard because it has a smaller board and it lets you aim the first shot, so you at least get some control over the starting conditions of the RNG cascade. That's in stark contrast to something like Ball in Air, which is 100% chaos and where your peg-based positioning barely seems to matter. Of course, just as important as taking a direct hand in manipulating probability is managing risk. By confronting us players with potentially random outputs, we're invited to plan contingencies and develop constantly evolving heuristics that are much more complex than in games where you always know the outcome of your choices. The marker for success in any tactics game or deck builder isn't your plan for when everything goes right and you get exactly what you wanted, but how you compensate for and react around everything going wrong. Many games earn a huge amount of depth by giving players a limited number of opportunities to avoid or mitigate chance, and the choice of where we spend stuff like XCOM's guaranteed hit grenades or Baldur's Gate's rerolls doesn't just give us some wiggle room when dealing with otherwise punitive systems, it rewards skill and planning. Weirdly enough, Dispatch of all games also has this same kind of choice system. You can guarantee that practically any mission completes by just throwing a full team at it, but because you only have so many Z-listers to go around, you risk making future missions harder if you send beautiful Flambe to bail out Jacksepticeye and Voice Critical, turning what would otherwise be a series of blind dice rolls into something with a contiguous sense of strategy. But even without the ability to outright mitigate chance, simply letting the player pick which risks they want to take forces us to navigate the choppy waters of chance entirely under our own power. A fun micro-genre example of this as a whole game are the grotesque side effects and the better well-known buckshot roulette, which are all about managing probability as you try not to pick the pill or shotgun shell that's gonna kill you. And where the slightest amount of control over which risk you want to take, like being able to test an option or skip a go, turns what would otherwise be pure boring randomness into an incredibly tense game of wits, bluffing, and maths, which as everybody knows is the most exciting thing of all. And, speaking of making our interactions with random mechanics and systems feel important, that's another huge element of making RNG satisfying to play with. The thing to remember is that our attachment to chance is fundamentally irrational. It doesn't matter how statistically significant any given event is, if it doesn't feel different from everything else, then we won't remember or care about it. What this means is the games need to make the results of their random systems evocative enough that we care about them and can use them as a jumping off point to make some new, interesting choices, rather than all the RNG just sort of dissolving into a vaguely distracting sludge. Procedurally generated worlds are a really clear example of this done well and badly. The planets in Starfield might be, from the joyless, dispassionate point of view of Todd Howard, very different. They've all got totally different terrains, entirely distinct colour palettes, and there are probably more potential configurations of this pirate-based template than there are hydrogen atoms in the universe. But that means sweet fuck all if they all feel the same to run around in. And in Starfield's case, they certainly do. Because no individual detail or quirk makes any given one of these bases stand out, they've all got more or less the same loot, more or less the same enemies, and more or less the same vibe, it contributes to a feeling that all the game's individual randomly generated areas just sort of blur together in a way that holds your attention but inspires no actual thought. This quirk of us not caring about statistical significance, but instead emotional impact, is why games that feel like they have more satisfying random generation are usually the ones operating from a smaller but more individually distinct pool of variables, that, as a result, all feel interesting and contrast with what came before. This is why No Man's Sky's proc-gen worlds, for example, feel a lot more interesting than its so-called competition. It's not that they're somehow more random, it's that each planet usually generates with some big, obvious characteristic that makes it stick in your mind, like a cool point of interest, or a big scary worm, or some crazy weather. Each reminding your brain that you've experienced something new and interesting, even if this exact feature is probably on a million different planets. Roguelikes also use this kind of design to their advantage. Often the games best known for consistently spitting out interestingly generated random levels actually aren't as random as you might think. The likes of Spelunky, Hades, and The Binding of Isaac, for example, all draw from a pool of fixed, pre-designed templates for their rooms that the designers know are going to be good and provide a specific kind of challenge that then just gets scrambled up a bit each time you load them up. This gives the impression that each room is totally different because they've all got their own unique thing going on, like this obstacle course, or this swarm battle, or this poop temple, whatever. which keeps them feeling much more distinct in comparison to a game that generates levels with much more variance, which, paradoxically, will often end up feeling the same. Far from just being emotionally evocative and memorable though, interesting spiky randomization provides an important gameplay purpose as well. By being notable instead of bland, the outputs of random systems can in turn force us to make new choices and interact with new systems, often catalyzing some more random outputs, which starts a self-sustaining cycle of interesting decisions. This is the engine that powers the emergent storytelling of stuff like RimWorld or Paradox games. You can't control when your kids are going to suddenly die or when some flesh beasts are going to turn up and eat half your dudes, but these random moments force you to interact with other chaotic systems, as you recruit sketchy wanderers to help you pick up the slack, only to find out they're being chased by a zombie horde, or start an ill-fated war to hold on to your ancestors' crumbling empire, keeping the story moving and unpredictable. The same principle is also what makes the improvised buildcraft of many roguelikes and deck builders work. Getting a really powerful item or passive in the Bazaar, for example, which is an excellent deck-building auto-battler, opens up a bunch of new potential synergies and strategies that shape your decision-making going forwards. And the game was dramatically improved when the devs decided to basically give players a free, incredibly powerful enchanted item near the start of each round, because these items serve as a great jumping-off point for your future strategy, helping your playthrough to feel much more unique. The same is true for other drafting-based games as well. Stuff like Slay the Spire or Magic the Gathering sets are specifically designed to only contain cards that synergize interestingly with the rest of the pool, so no matter what combination of cards the game spits out, you'll never get a bunch of generic blocks of stats you don't know what to do with. You'll always get at least a few options which seem to immediately stand out as potential inclusions that will in turn shape the identity of your deck in interesting ways. Conversely to all this, when random generation takes the form of loads of little tiny outputs rather than a few big obvious ones, the results of very granular systems have a tendency to kind of regress to the mean, which leads to that boring feeling where it's impossible to really care about any given one. I'm gonna earn some enemies here, but I felt this very strongly in two recent indie darlings in the form of Megabonk and Ball X Pit. In Megabonk, because most of your upgrades are sort of vague incremental improvements, and because you get so many, way more than other survivor style games, your brain quickly learns that it's way too much effort trying to work out if 12.8% better AoE damage or 30% crit damage is stronger every 15 seconds, and so you just start mindlessly clicking the thing with higher rarity because you won't really notice either way, leading to an impression that your decisions don't matter. And in Ball X Pit, you get a bunch of really visually cool and mechanically distinct upgrades, but they never really change the way you play or the way you make decisions. Outside of a handful of mostly quite bad balls, the ideal trajectory is always the same, and so long as you're picking up all the gems and boosters, it doesn't really matter what you end up fusing your balls into, as demonstrated by the fact that the unlockable character that makes decisions literally at random isn't really much of a handicap at all, and kind of ends up exposing how brain-dead the game's strategy really is. There is, of course, a corollary to the idea that chance-based games need these big, important feeling tempos, and that's that if games lean too much on this stuff, they kind of wrap back around to 99% of the outputs feeling meaningless and boring. Borderlands may very well boast 69 fart squillion guns, but because the interesting handmade legendary guns are always better, the actual pool of weapons you would choose to use is usually more like 30, which isn't even half of 69. This serves to make even the coolest of loot explosions feel disappointing, because you're really only looking for legendaries, with everything else being an implicit downgrade, and thus a sign of bad luck. Path of Exile, another looty game, fixes this to a degree by having its unique items, the highest rarity, provide niche effects that you can't get anywhere else that enable interesting builds, but are kept to a roughly equivalent power to regular or rare items that drop much more frequently, making a much higher proportion of the loot actually interesting and keeping you in the frame of mind of playing a video game rather than just gambling on swords. Which brings us to the rather large elephant in the room. See, this whole video, I've been describing the shallow but hypnotizing kinds of chance that makes us feel like we've wasted our time playing a game as the design flaw, as something the game should avoid using, because as loads of great titles prove, randomness can be compelling and satisfying at the same time. But for many games, and for many developers, that hollow feeling you get from having spent hours doing nothing but chasing the fleeting dopamine rush of hitting a high roll is a feature, not a bug. I've been avoiding directly referencing real-life gambling too much because I'm scared YouTube are going to demonetize me, but you need only look at the scary footage of old people being hypnotized by slot machines while simultaneously being totally fucking miserable to understand the fact that a sense of dissatisfaction is often what gets you to come back to a game much more reliably than you having had a complete, fun experience. So many games are fundamentally predicated on deliberately hooking you in with attention-grabbing RNG that provides no interesting decision-making or unique outputs, just the flashiest, most distracting rolls of the dice possible. And it's not because they're accidentally designed this way, but because if their randomization systems were fun and satisfying on their own, you wouldn't need to supplement your enjoyment with another injection of cash. It's absolutely no coincidence that basically all gacha games have mind-bogglingly overcomplicated progression systems it's impossible to feel like you have any agency in, broken scaling that minimises the impact of individual strategy, and really samey gameplay. It's all to get you back to the pulls, where you can sift through a bunch of garbage you don't care about for the slim chance of some fleeting novelty and the chance to woggle a slightly different anime teenager for a bit. And look, I know gacha games and other free-to-play stuff that keeps you hooked on the same boring chores so you keep paying a sub fee or whatever are kind of easy targets here, but when you're dealing with design that's so destructive so as to literally ruin people's lives in the name of money, then I think we deserve a few cheap shots every now and again. Furthermore, this is just as true for supposedly ethical games you only pay for once. I've been trapped in more than one abusive relationship with a regular title that used all the same manipulative tricks to get me to come back to the slot machine over and over because our brains are incapable of looking away from random systems, and the more times we fail to get what we want out of them, the more compelling they become. I wasted hours on Elden Ring Night Rain before I realised that it wasn't really for me because the promise of the next run being different coerced me back into doing something that I didn't really enjoy very much, and usually ended with me getting pounded into dust. And I put a quite frankly embarrassing amount of time into Hearthstone Battlegrounds even before they added all the microtransaction stuff, because the promise of getting to roll an absurdly overpowered combo kept me coming back in spite of the fact that 7 out of 8 of my runs were dull losses and they were all pretty foregone conclusions. This is why I think that our relationship with chance is an important issue worth discussing and clarifying. It would suck for manipulatively designed, shallow games to rob us of the opportunity to have some really fun experiences that can only exist in a random framework. But in order for us to be able to distinguish between good randomness and manipulative randomness, we need to be able to confront the uncomfortable reality that effective design used in service of art is more similar than we'd like to cheap psychological manipulation that you'll eventually grow to resent. So, when you next find yourself getting sucked into the rhythm of a surprising, exciting, and compulsive random game, take a second to think about why you're really there. Are you having a fun time because randomness is letting you make interesting decisions and provide you with cool new things to do, or are you grinding away at a repetitive skill box dragged along by your hypnotized subconscious? Only you can know for sure, and I reckon the answer is going to be a bit different for everyone. All that matters is that you keep an open mind and a rational perspective. Just look at that 99% chance and see it as nothing but pure maths. Just one possible permutation of a random system, and then you're gonna turn the game off, take your PC outside, and smash it to bits with a big fucking hammer! Phew. Hello, and welcome to this frosty holiday after the video segment. Now, hold on, I know what you're thinking. Where's 2025 games you should have played? Don't worry, it's coming on time, you're not gonna miss anything. Chill out. But, while you're here, how about taking a look at some cool people who you really ought to be made aware of, such as Harper J, an excellent games writer who's recently gotten back into the biz after a sojourn doing real work, and is now back to writing some of the most intelligent, incisive analysis in the entire biz. Harper has, in my opinion, the definitive read on more gaming culture topics than I care to count, and just recently has written some fantastic, thought-provoking stuff about the culture of quote-unquote prestige games surrounding Expedition 33, as well as the controversy behind infamous, cancelled, and very good game Horses, and how weirdly the game sort of preemptively comments on the conversation surrounding its own censorship. Harper is great, and she doesn't get anywhere near as much attention as I think she deserves, so please do go and give her stuff a read. Of course, the real cool people, the radical cats, the smooth, bodacious son of a guns, who you have to thank for the fact that this video, and all other videos on the channel, exist at all. The people who give this channel money via YouTube and Patreon are responsible for me staying on the air, and I am ever more aware of how truly grateful I am to them for their continued support during the busy holiday period. If you'd like to support the channel and join them, you'll get early access to videos, behind the scenes content, extra game design musings that the general public don't get to see, so there's a lot of stuff to go around. I think it's a pretty good deal. And of course, if you spend $10 a month on Patreon, then you'll even get a special voiced shoutout like these cool people, who are Agent Maxwell, Ali Wright, Andrew Lebrano, Aula94, Baroness Caroline, Bobby, Constantine Amend, Cosmix360, Daniel Medjes, Daniel Ursin, Dirk Jan Karembeld, Digletier, Dis Ellie, Ecton, Edward Franklin Woods, Edwina the Space Bun, Eric Woolston, Eugene Bulkin, Fullabaxi, Furious Hulk, Gazkul, How, Hecate Noah, I Support Trans Rights, Jacob Dylan Riddle, Jinkaloid, Justin Dent, Kevin Help Us, Conlove, Kangi, Leap Year Everyday, Luke Kokoran, Macewood54, Maxim Filipov, Mark Vallant, May Contain Fox-Like Substance, Mika Oi, Michael C., Mike Oxlong, Mike Ox Medium, Jesus Christ, Nate Graff, Oliver Marhofer, Patrick Romberg, Peter Tomasic, Reddidex, Regal Wedgex, Seslux, Silver Forfy, Tyler Duncan, Timotheus Beksek, Whimsical Wisp, Zach Brandmeier, and ciao. Okay, that's it from me. See you very soon. Bye!